So that's when I hit my knees. And I said, okay, for 26 years, I've had issues with the church. I've talked to your apologists. I've read your apologetics. Nothing works for me. If this is what you want, that's great, but I need answers, and I haven't gotten answers in 26 years. It's hard to ignore that miracle. I was on my deathbed, and I was immediately healed.
You called, he answered.
Sometimes God parts the waters. Most of the time, he just whispers. But now and then, he uses a 2x4.
Now is the time for you and for me to prepare for the second coming of our Lord and Savior, Jesus the Christ.
Welcome to True Millennial. My name is Parker Walbeck, and today I've got a special guest in Dusty Smith, the Dusty Smith. Thanks for coming on, Dusty. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for inviting me.
So Dusty was in town. He's doing he's always doing firesides and devotionals. Ashley Stone from Comeback Podcast is doing this awesome event here in St. George. And I said, Dusty Smith is going to be in town in my city. I got to get him on the podcast. I initially heard you on Ashley Stone's podcast a couple years back, and it's one of my favorite podcasts she's done, having been anti-Mormon. Firstly, a convert, then anti-Mormon for 26 years?
26.
And then comes back to the church, and now he's just an Alma the Younger out preaching the gospel and sharing his testimony. 126 firesides, is that right?
Worldwide, yeah.
Worldwide. And so it's a privilege to have you on. And we just wanted to hear your story. I want to be able to ask a few follow-up questions, but I'll just give you the floor and let people know of your amazing conversion and reconversion story.
Okay. Well, I guess background is important because I wasn't raised in the church. As you said, I was a convert. I grew up, I was born in 1960, so I'm an old guy. The first 5 years of my life was with my mom and my dad, but my dad wasn't always the nicest person when he drank, and he drank quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And my mother would come in and she'd say, it's not you, it's the alcohol. And I said, I'm never going to drink alcohol when I was 5.
Wow.
And so I was raised. He left when I was 5, by the way, and had no contact with him. I was raised primarily by my mother with a lot of help from my grandmother and my grandfather, her parents. Now, the interesting thing about that dynamic was my mother was Lutheran, my grandfather was Catholic, and my grandmother was Baptist.
Wow.
So I spent my younger years going to all 3 denominations. Yeah. I was so confused. I wasn't sure if I should stand, sit, kneel, sprinkle, dunk, or pour. But I always loved the Lord. But I always wondered why there was so many differences between the churches that used the same book.
Right.
How could there be? Why is there so many differences? But I grew up loving the Lord. I went to the University of Texas to college. In my 3rd year at UT, a family friend was killed in a weird accident. She was running home from school, thought the glass doors on the house were open. They were closed. She ran through the glass door, landed on a piece of glass, and they killed her instantly. And I became incredibly upset with God. Why would you let this happen to this young 13-year-old girl? I stopped going to church, stopped being, I can't say I didn't believe in God, because to be angry at God, you got to believe God exists, right? You can't be angry at something that doesn't exist. But I didn't go to church. I kind of just turned my back. Graduated from University of Texas in 82. In 83, I went home to visit my mother. Well, I went home to wash clothes.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's more accurate.
Yeah. And the fridge was always full.
Yeah, that's right.
My mother had been to Salt Lake City on business, and somebody had given her a Book of Mormon. She was with the Veterans Administration, and somebody given her a Book of Mormon when she was in Salt Lake City. And she had put it on the bookshelf in my old bedroom. And so I was washing clothes. I wanted to read a Louis L'Amour Western. I was looking on the bookshelf, looking for a Louis L'Amour Western. The Book of Mormon fell off my bookshelf. So I sat down and opened it up and began to read, and I just happenstance opened it up to 3rd Nephi, and I thought, well, this is interesting.
It's a good spot to open up to.
Yeah, I'd never heard this before, that Christ came to this side of the world, and so I became curious. So I went to the phone book and I looked up. And this is where y'all are really weird, because if I want to look up church for Baptist, you just look up church. You look up parish for Catholic. Ward or stake. Okay.
What is that?
Yeah, what the heck is that? Didn't know what number to call, but it was lunchtime and I was hungry, so I called the stake. and the stake president answered the phone. I didn't know he was a stake president. A guy answered the phone.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm never here during the week, but I forgot something on Sunday, came by during lunch to pick it up. And it just happened to be the stake president. So we chatted for a minute, and because of my curiosity, he suggested that I meet with the missionaries, and so I did at the University Ward, the University of Texas. And shortly thereafter, I was baptized. But I was a college graduate. I had a job. But immediately people started bugging me to go on a mission. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm never going to go on a mission. I'm a college graduate. I have a job.
Yeah.
I'm not a college kid who can just take a break during college and go on a mission.
And you mentioned a fiance at this time, too.
I had a fiance at the time. So I was kind of moving toward that settled life with a job and a wife and everything. And people would bug me about it. You should go on. And I was very adamant. I'm never going on a mission. So anyway, while I was at the MTC, I was 24 when I went on my mission. And I felt like I was babysitting.
All these 18, 19-year-olds.
Oh, my goodness. Running up and down the halls. First time away from home. I felt really out of place.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, because when I became a member of the church, a lot of my family and friends turned their backs on me. Mm-hmm. When I quit my job to go on a mission where I was not going to make any money, they thought I was absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there with these kids running down the hall and pillow fights, and it was just child stuff that I hadn't done in 5 years. I'm not sure I ever did some of that stuff. But I thought, well, if nobody cares if I'm here, I'm going to go home.
Yeah.
So I went to the payphone there at the MTC. I called church headquarters. And lady answered the phone, and I said, if nobody cares if I'm here, I'm going home. And she said, can you hold for a second? So I wait for a few seconds, and this voice comes on the phone. It says, Elder, if nobody else cares if you serve a mission, I do. My name is L. Tom Perry. So Elder Perry and I had a conversation, and he discovered my background, that I didn't have a lot of family support.
Yeah.
So he asked if I would be his pen pal on my mission. So I was. And when I got off my mission, he invited me up to his office to give him a mission report. After my mission, I went to law school. I went in a foreign country, Michigan. And in my third year of law school, which is law school is 3 years, so my last year of law school, I happened to be at a position where I could go to Palmyra for the pageant. So I went to the pageant in Palmyra and encountered something that I had not encountered this was 89, so I'd have been a member for 6 years. And some of that had been as a missionary.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a huge foundation in the church. I didn't have a lot of knowledge of history. I just didn't have a lot of background and foundation. And I encountered these antis, and they were everywhere in Palmyra. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know what? I need to be better prepared for these guys. So I came back from that experience wanting to be better, smarter, more knowledgeable, kind of dig into things that I had never dug into before because between mission and law school, there wasn't a lot of time for getting into that. So, but I began to find things I'd never heard before in these old doctrine and old history books. And when you asked questions in 89, you were told, don't ask questions, just have faith.
Different culture.
Different culture. One thing I love about the church now is the fact that they are more transparent, more open, even the warts, and I like that about the church. Like we're an open book, I love that. But back then we weren't. And I woke up one day, after being told all these, don't ask questions, just have faith. I woke up one day and I thought, you know what, if they're trying to hide stuff from me, then it's not true. And I lost my testimony. And I wrote a letter to the stake president, and I said, please take my name off church records. And a few weeks later, I got a letter that I've been excommunicated, which is what they did back then. They don't do that now, I don't think. But they did that back then. And that made me very angry.
Yeah.
And that's why I became, anti. I decided if the church is true, it's my duty to advise everybody and warn everybody, help those in it, warn those out of it. And I spent 26 years doing that. I hated the church. I hated the church. There's a popular saying, people can leave the church but can't leave it alone.
Why is that?
It's hard to speak for everybody, but for me, and I'm probably the same as a lot of them, we feel deceived.
Yeah.
Okay? If I become a Baptist, my life doesn't change. I go to the Baptist church on Sundays. I go to Sunday school, maybe get a little involved in some of their community things, but my life doesn't change. I don't have to change how I eat, sleep, drink. Nothing changes. Become Lutheran. I don't have to change anything. To become a member of the church, my life had to change. I had to give up a lot of things that as a Texan, I love, like my iced tea. I love my iced tea. Okay? I still love my iced tea. I can't drink it, but I love it. Okay? But I had to give up things. And I gave up a job to, fiance. My fiance left me when I was on my mission, married somebody else. I gave up so much to be a member. Had my family and friends that turned their backs on me. I gave up all of that for the church, and I felt deceived. And so I wanted to warn people. I hated the church. No one likes to feel like they've been cheated.
Right.
And I spent 26 years doing that. When I was part of that, I was in the Army, but I discovered the internet. And I could argue with people from the comfort of my own home.
Yeah.
And I joined a group called What Do Mormons Really Believe? It was a Yahoo group. And I went to go tell them what they really believed.
Yeah.
And during that whole encounter, I was one of the most hated people on that website. But I met a guy named Mike. And Mike and I, although we had some really bitter debates in the beginning, became friends over time. And he would say, you're going to come back to the church. And I'd say, I'm never coming back to the church. I'll be your friend. We can have fun. We can chat. But I'm never coming back to the church. And in 2009, I was an attorney in Texas, and I had to go down to do a deposition in Laredo, Texas, which is right on the border. And had to do a deposition, and I came back with a souvenir. The swine flu. And we'll never know how many people the swine flu killed because we didn't test everybody like we did for COVID.
Yeah.
But hundreds of thousands we know of died from swine flu around the world, probably a lot more than that. And there was no cure. And I was very, very, very ill. I was on my deathbed. I called the VA. I'm a disabled veteran. I called the VA. And I said, I'm dying. And they said, what are your symptoms? And I said, the ones you get when you're dying. And they said, you been to Mexico? And I said, yes. They said, don't come here. Nobody would see me. They were too afraid of the disease. So I'm laying on my deathbed. There's a knock on my door. And my son, my oldest boy, inexplicably lets into my house 2 missionaries. Worse than that, he brings them up to my deathbed. And one of the missionaries, I kid you not, looks at me and says, you're sick. And I remember thinking to myself, well, the Spirit is strong in that one. And I told them to get out of my house. And they said, can we give you a blessing? And I said, well, to get you out of my house. And they said, yes. So I got the blessing, and I was immediately healed. I don't mean that I got better over the next couple of days. I mean that in that moment, my sweating stopped, my fever broke. I was able to get out of bed for the first time in days.
Wow.
And I walked them downstairs and said, don't ever come back to my house. I hated the church.
So the miracle didn't create faith.
I always attributed back then, I thought, just because the church is false doesn't mean that God doesn't hear prayers.
You still believed in God.
I never stopped believing in God. I don't understand how people don't believe in God.
Yeah.
To not believe in God means we're an accident. I can't imagine anybody that I've ever met being an accident. Okay, it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, you look around at the beauty in life and you think that's just accidental. No, I don't believe that. Anyway, so yeah, I still believed in God. In 2014, jump ahead another 5 years, my wife got a job opportunity within her company. She'd been with the company for a lot of years, but she wanted to go, to gain positions in the company and get better opportunities. And this opportunity was in management, but she was going to have to move to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I was in Dallas. We were in Dallas. And we decided that she would go ahead and do this, but that we would have this plan that she would do that. We would visit once a month in Shreveport, which was about halfway between Baton Rouge and Dallas. And we would meet once a month in Shreveport until the same position opened up in Texas, and she could make the lateral move, which is better than a upward move, a lateral move, and everything would be copacetic, right? So she did that. And the district that she took charge of with her company, she was going to be in charge of the district that ran from Texas to Florida. And it was in the 40s. And she took that district and made it number 4 in the company. Her reward for that was in January of 2015, she got a call saying, we're going to close your district. You'll get your severance paperwork.
Oh, wow.
So she called me up and says, what do I do? I said, well, come on back home. We'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. We got this. The next day, the vice president of the company calls her and says, don't sign anything. There's a position open in Baltimore. Put your paperwork into Baltimore and hang tight because it's a 2-week vetting process for any of these positions. So just hang tight in Baton Rouge. Put your paperwork in for Baltimore. So Suze calls me and says, should I do this? And I said, sure. I won't visit with you once a month in Baltimore, but we'll figure it out. But in the meantime, that plan is still in effect. You'll do that until the same position opens up in Dallas or in Texas, and you can come back. So I called my friend Mike, the one that's the member of the church that I was telling you about. I called him. I said, Mike, do me a favor. Would you please pray for Susan to get this position in Baltimore? Mike said, I'll pray for it. Now, that was a crossroads in my life. I should have said, thank you, Mike. You're a good friend, and hang up the phone. But I'm not that way. I said, however, if the Lord really wants me to be a member of the church, he will send Susan to Utah. Good plan, because there were no openings in Utah.
Yeah, safe.
Yeah, safe. No openings in Utah. I was that day. The very next day, the person in Utah retired. And the very next day, her paperwork was transferred from Baltimore to Salt Lake, and she was hired immediately without the 2-week vetting.
Wow.
So I called Mike and I said, you're not going to believe this. Susan's going to Utah. He said, well, you know what you told God. Yeah. I said, I was just joking. He said, God wasn't.
Yeah.
So that's when I hit my knees. And I said, okay, for 26 years, I've had issues with the church. I've talked to your apologists. I've read your apologetics. Nothing works for me. Their apologetics just don't work. So if this is what you want, that's great, but I need answers, and I haven't gotten answers in 26 years.
So was this the first time where you were open to
Yes.
reinvestigating?
Yes. It's hard to ignore that miracle that just happened.
You called, he answered.
Yeah. Sometimes God parts the waters. Most of the time he just whispers, but now and then he uses a 2x4. You ever notice that?
I have. But it seemed like there was almost a little bit of desire or interest on your end by throwing that out to Mike.
If I were to be completely honest, for 26 years I felt the pull to come back. Okay? But I never accepted it as a pull to come back. If you were to ask me during the time that I hated the church the most, which it's hard to pick a year in the 26 years where you could say was the most. I mean, I really hated the church.
Yeah.
But if you were to pick whatever time during that 26 years before I got married to Susan and say, what was the best time of your life? I would have said, my mission. I loved being a missionary. And I looked back on my mission very fondly, even when I hated the church so much. And so what I thought was it was the fondness of my memories of that mission that I was feeling for 26 years. It wasn't the pull to come back.
Right.
So when this happened, I thought, well, maybe it was more than a pull, and maybe I really do need to be humble about this. So I hit my knees, and over the next few weeks, I'd wake up in the middle of the night with an answer to an issue that I had never heard before, but it worked for me. Until I woke up one day in March of 2015 and I had my testimony back. And
How long did that take?
Probably about a month.
Yeah.
Of constant waking up in the middle of the night with a new answer. And I wasn't talking to anybody about it. I wasn't talking to Mike about it. I wasn't, I really wasn't sharing my feelings and my journey during that month.
Just
but
you and God.
And I would wake up and I'd think, I had never heard that before. But that makes sense. Mm-hmm. You want an example?
Yes.
One of the biggest issues that I always had was archaeology. I would tell Mike, if I can walk the streets of Jerusalem, I should be able to walk the streets of Zarahemla. Mm-hmm. Okay? And Mike would say, well, it's because it was in the jungles are over. I said, Mike, I've lived in Central America. They're not going to build their cities in the jungles. They're going to build them in the mountains, on the lakes, by the ocean. Not where the jungles are going to cover them up. No one wants to fight mosquitoes and snakes and bugs all night. They're going to where the food is plentiful, by the lake, by the ocean, in the mountains. Because I lived in Central America, I knew these things. So I had a dream one night during that time, and the Lord said, "Let me ask you a question. If you walk the streets of Jerusalem, does that make the Bible true?" And I said, "No." And he said, "But if you're excavating someplace and you come across a sign and you wipe it off and it says, 'Welcome to Zarahemla, population 450, what does that do?" And I said, "It makes the Book of Mormon completely and absolutely true." And the Lord said, "Then why would you need faith?" That was the first time I'd gotten an answer that made sense to me. We don't know because we're not supposed to know yet where these places are exactly. We're not supposed to know because we are supposed to operate on faith. And if it doesn't take faith, then there's no need for us to even be here.
Yeah.
That made sense to me, but no one had ever said that to me before.
Mm-hmm. But it was the answer you got directly from the Lord.
And it worked for me. Yeah. And I'm not saying that answer will work for anybody else. Okay? The Lord will talk to them the way the Lord talks to them when the Lord talks to them. But for me, it worked. And that's just one example. But there were several examples. And I woke up one morning and I had my testimony back, and I called Mike and I bore my testimony, and he truly wept like a child.
Wow.
For 20 years, he had put my name in the temple every week for 20 years. And a couple of weeks later, Susan was living in Salt Lake. She had gotten an apartment, and I came to visit her. It was a long weekend for me. It was Easter weekend, and my law firm had Good Friday off. And it had the benefit of our anniversary because we got married April Fool's Day. So we thought that was appropriate.
Yeah.
So it was our anniversary. It was Easter weekend, long weekend. I came to Salt Lake to visit her. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a disabled veteran. I've had 6 knee surgeries. I've got screws in my leg. I can't run, but I walk every day. I walk 5 miles a day. And I was out walking in Salt Lake. And the Lord said, "This is home now." And I said, "No, it's not. I live in Texas. I have a house. I have a really nice job at a law firm.
Yeah.
No, this is not home. Me, Texan." The Lord said, "This is home now." And I said, "No, I've got a really good job in Texas and I have a house, Lord. You may have seen it." And he said, "This is home now." And I said, "Susan does not want to live here forever. We have a plan." I get back to her apartment and I said, "Hey, baby, out of curiosity, what do you think about Utah?" And she said, "I've been wondering how to bring it up to you. I truly don't ever want to leave."
Wow.
I said, "Okay, let me go back to Dallas and see about selling the house." So I get back to Dallas and I call a realtor. A realtor comes out. Now, I loved my house in Dallas, but it had issues. It was built in 1929. Okay, the foundation was kind of wonky, and we had the old screw-in fuses, and not to flip the switch, so you had to unscrew a fuse and put a new fuse back in. I mean, it had issues. And the realtor said, "You can't sell this house." And I said, "Why not?" She goes, "Number one, you'll never pass code, and you'll spend too much money putting it up to code that you won't make any money selling it. You won't get what the house is worth." I said, "Okay." I called Susan and said, "We can't sell the house. Maybe we can rent it. We'll figure something out." Well, I got rebaptized. The week after my baptism, I got a knock on my door. Guy says, "I want to buy your house." I said, "My house isn't for sale." He said, "Don't care. Won't buy it." I said, "That makes me happier than you can possibly fathom, but I don't have the money to fix this up to sell it to you and get it to code."
Yeah.
He said, "Nope, I want to buy it as is." I said, "How much?" And he told me, and it was more than the house was worth.
Wow.
I called Susan and told her, and she said, "Man, when God wants you someplace, He really wants you someplace." Now, the rest of that story is about a year later. We're sitting in the apartment in Salt Lake, and I get a phone call. The fellow says, "I want to buy your house in Dallas." I said, "I've already sold that house." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Pretty sure. I was there." He said, "And did you get the money?" And I said, "And spent it." And he said, "Hang on." He shuffled some papers, and he said, "The guy who bought your house disappeared. That house is abandoned and in foreclosure." That house sat abandoned for like 4 years. Somebody else bought it eventually, and now it's a nice-looking house. They fixed it all up, but it was
strange.
Sat vacant for 4 years. A couple of weeks later, Susan and I go to Moab. She wants to show me the arches. And so I'm in the hotel room waiting for her to get ready. I'm kind of just walking around, pacing. I like to walk. And I get a phone call. Woman says, "I see you've been on the church website and want information on the church." I said, "No, wasn't me." She said, "Well, sir, the only way that your name and number pop up on my screen is if you were on the website and want information on the church." I said, "Be that as it may." Wasn't me. She said, "Well, how do you suppose to tell me, sir, how I got your name and number?" I said, "I don't know, but my computer is in Salt Lake and I'm in Moab."
Yeah.
And she said, "You remember the church?" I said, "Let me tell you a story." So I told her my story, and she says, after I get done, she's in tears. And she said, I'm at the MTC and I'm having a crisis of faith, going to go home. So while that's all processing, he put me on answering these people that want information on a church.
Yeah.
Your name and number came up, so I called you. Thank you for your story. I'm going to go finish my mission.
Wow.
A couple weeks after that, another phone call. Woman says, "Is this Dusty?" I said, "Yes, it is." And she says, "Would you please hold for President Uchtdorf?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And he gets on the phone and he says, "My understanding is that you left the church for 26 years and you were an anti, and you came back." And I said, "That's true." And he said, "Will you come visit with me?" I said, "Sure." So I go visit with him. And he says, "I'm going to use your story in general conference." I said, "Okay." He says, "I'm not going to use your name." I said, "That's fine." And in October 2016 general conference priesthood session, on a talk about Alma and Amulek, he tells my story. In January of 2017, Susan and I go on a date. Well, we would go to a gun show. And I don't know how y'all date in Utah. In Texas, we go to gun shows.
Yeah.
But I needed a holster, and I saw a table selling holsters, and so I will go over there, and I'm talking to the fellow that's selling the holsters, and he said, "You're not from around here." I said, "No, I'm not." He says, "Why are you here?" I said, "Let me tell you a story." He said, "Wait a second, that talk that Elder Uchtdorf gave was about you?" And I said, "Yep." And he goes, "Can we chat for a second?" And I said, "Sure." So Susan and this guy and I walk over to a little quiet section of the Sandy Expo Center, and another fella at the table follows us over. I get done telling my story, and the fellow that had followed us over says, "You're from Dallas?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oak Cliff?" And I said, yep. And he said, you don't remember me. But 8 years ago, you had the swine flu, and I gave you a blessing.
Wow.
The rest of that story is after his mission, he'd gone inactive. Before the 2016 priesthood session, his bishop said, I've had enough of your inactivity. Here's a ticket to the priesthood session. Go watch it. He goes and watches it. He hears the story, the talk about Alm and Amulek, and it reanimates him, not realizing that it was about somebody he'd given a blessing to 8 years earlier.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's just been one thing up. And look, there's been many more miracles dealing with my cancer, dealing with other stuff, but that's the story of me coming back to the church, my conversion, and then coming back to the church. It's been an incredible ride.
That's amazing. It's such an inspiring story for so many reasons, but I think we all just have family, friends, or even personal times where we feel the pull of the world and the anti-information that's out there. And it's a real draw. It's a real draw to lean into doubt and to abandon faith, and to see somebody who has gone that route and fought their way back. I think it's just incredibly inspiring. And I think that's why your story resonates with so many people.
It's a story of hope.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that it shows, I hope that it shows, is that it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done. The Lord's very aware of you. The Lord loves you. The Lord loves you as if you were the only person on the earth. And that he has all these people in the world, the billions of people in the world, and yet he had time for me. You know, that's just...
Even when you were trying to...
Even when I hated the church and were trying to hurt people in the church. I didn't want to hurt people in the church. I thought I was doing them a favor.
You wanted to yank them out.
I wanted to help them out, you know. Mm-hmm. But even when at my worst, he loved me. That's insane. Why would he love me? When I met with Elder Uchtdorf, he asked me. We were sitting kind of like you and I are sitting, only he was in front of me. And he asked me, he said, do you have a testimony of the atonement? I said, that's a trick question. He said, why is that a trick question? I said, because I believe in it for you. I don't believe in it for me. He said, why not? And I was sitting kind of like this, and I was looking at the floor. And I said, because I spent 26 years doing all I could to hurt the church. And I'm staring at the floor, and he says, Dusty. And I looked up, and he had that kind of half smile you see on his face when he gives a talk sometimes. And he looked at me straight in my eyes, and he said, your sins are forgiven. Wow. That I could do all of that, and the Lord still says, I still love you. You get another chance. That's... Wow. When I met with him, I had Susan with me, and Susan was a Southern Baptist, and she had told me when I came back to the church, she said, you know, I'll support you. I'll go to church with you. I'll go to functions with you, but I will never, ever get baptized, ever. And I never pressured her. I did say this. I would say, hey, baby, my patriarchal blessing says I get sealed in the temple. I'd like it to be with you.
No pressure.
No pressure. But we met with him, and he has such a way. Not many people can do this, but when he speaks to you, you feel the love. Mm-hmm. You feel it. And he turned to her and he said, you know, I know that you're not a member of the church, but bring what you know and we'll add to it. Mm-hmm. And then he told her, he said, I know that Dusty wants to be sealed to you. I'll save a place for you in the temple. They chatted for a little bit. Next day, she said, I'm ready for the discussions.
Wow.
And a few months later, I had that unique pleasure of baptizing my own spouse. And then a year after that, we were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple.
That's amazing.
The love of the Lord is strong. You know, if you think about all the people that do stuff, good or bad, and the Lord loves them the same. He doesn't love the apostles more than he loves you. He loves you just as much as if he, like I said, if you were the only person in the world. Mm-hmm. How much love is that? You think that if he does everything perfectly, I think that I can't love Susan any more than I love her, but tomorrow I'm going to love her more. The Lord doesn't love me more tomorrow. He loves me infinite right now. No matter what I've done, no matter what I've thought, no matter what I've said, he loves me. Now, sometimes he wants me to act a little better, and again, that two before thing, but he loves me, and he loves everybody the same way. That's just, our minds can't comprehend that kind of pure love.
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, I want to go back in your story just a little bit. The time you were anti, it sounds like there was seasons where you were aggressive online. I don't know if it was the entire 26 years, but take me back to your most aggressive times as an anti-Mormon, and you were actively spending a lot of your own time, personal free time, to tear people away from the church. Help us get inside that mindset so we can understand how to have productive conversations with those that attack our faith.
You probably will never have a productive conversation with an anti.
What did Mike do that was different than anyone else you talked to that?
He didn't argue with me.
And it led to a relationship.
He didn't argue with me. He did in the beginning, and it didn't get anywhere.
Yeah, and he recognized that.
And he understood. And look, I would bring up stuff that most antis will know more about the church than you ever know, because they study it just to argue with you. Mm-hmm. And I would bring up things to Mike he'd never heard, and he'd go study it and come back try to give me an answer. And I would like, it's not a good answer, Mike. Yeah. I was pretty aggressive. Like I said, I was hated on that board. False church, false prophet, false God, false everything, not the same Jesus, not the same God. I was incredibly, incredibly aggressive. When I was in the Army in Panama, I was stationed in Panama part of the time, and there was a ship, like a cruise ship kind of thing. But what they did was they went to the different ports, and they would go out during the day and proselyte to people, and then invite them on the ship in the evening for talks and discussions and stuff. And I was invited to teach people about the evils of the Mormon church. And I did. Yeah. I actually went on the ship and we gave classes. Big talks with hundreds of people in Spanish. And English, but in Spanish and English, and in
the language you learn to preach the gospel of the restored church.
Exactly. The irony just drips, doesn't it? But that's how anti I was. I taught classes. I would stop missionaries and argue with them, and I will tell you that you don't argue with an anti.
You don't win.
You don't win. You can't win. You cannot win, and actually, the anti wins when he gets you to argue with him.
To engage.
Yeah. If I can get you to have that animosity enough to argue with me, and I can build that animosity in you, I win. Because now you're not getting the spirit.
Yeah.
You know, it was the old saying, when you wrestle with pigs, you get muddy. That people ask me all the time. Literally thousands of emails and messages I've gotten over the last 7 years. And one of the big questions is, how do I handle this? How do I handle my son or my daughter or my boyfriend, my husband, my wife, whatever that's left the church? And I say, you love them back. You love them back. You don't argue with them. If they want to argue, say, I'm not going to argue with you. You know, I'm not. I'm going to pray for you. I'm not going to argue with you. Invite them to functions, but don't get offended when they say no. Pray for them. Put their names in the temple. Mike did that for 20 years. Be Mike. Mm-hmm. Mike stopped arguing with me. He couldn't win. I'm an attorney. You're not going to beat me. I know how to debate. I know how to get under your skin. I know what buttons to push. I'm paid to do that. So love them back. Love them back. Don't argue them back. You're not going to ever argue them back.
Yeah. I think that's something I've felt as I've had those moments, especially as a missionary. You have to kind of learn that firsthand, Bible bashing. And after 10 rounds of Bible bashing and going nowhere, you realize this is not productive. And I've just recognized what you're saying now, especially on social media, because I do this now weekly. I'm posting stuff, and you'll always get anti stuff. And in the beginning, I'd engage, and it caused a lot of anxiety, and like you're talking about, this turmoil in me. And I recognized really quickly, I had my own revelation from God that the anxiety you're feeling isn't just broadly because you're on social media. It's because you're engaging in contention. And as soon as I recognized that and stepped away from contentious environments, the peace returned back to my life.
I won't say his name, but there's a very popular, in anti-circles, a very popular podcaster, speaker, whatever he is. He actually invited me to be on his show. Mm-hmm. I said, no, thank you. He said, you afraid of me? I said, no, I'm afraid of me. Yeah. I'm afraid of me because I don't lose debates. And I can get nasty. And you push me and I will get nasty. Yeah. And that's not going to help anybody. It won't help me, and it won't help anybody that listens to me. It won't help you. But I'm afraid of me, not afraid of you. And I am. I know my limitations. I know where, because if I want to beat you, I will beat you. I'll find a way. I'm 65 years old almost. I've been doing this my whole life. And I'm trying to say egotistical that I can't be beaten. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that would be my goal, is to beat you.
But winning's the wrong goal.
Winning is losing. Yeah. I win if I don't argue with you, if I just pray for you, because at some point you're gonna be softened. It may not be this year, next year, or 26 years, but at some point you will be softened. At some point you will come back to the church if you've left. At some point you will come back. You might say, oh, listen, I'm never going to come back. I said that for 26 years. You will come back. It may not be in this life, but you will come back to the church. And it's just God's time, not our time. Mm-hmm. I don't, if you think of what Mike has done, think about it from Mike's perspective. And Mike and I are still friends, by the way. We chat frequently. Yeah. He lives in Springville. And when I got my blessings restored, he was there when I had my first temple visit again. And of course, he was there when we got sealed, he and his wife. But think of it from Mike's perspective. He meets me on a board, starts putting my name in the temple. 20 years, weekly. The video I did for a group called High Five Live has had over 1 million views. The article in LDS Living magazine had 600,000 views, and that was before it came out in hard copy. You can look at the things that I've done on YouTube that have had 100,000 views or 250,000 views or whatever. Think about you're probably total over 2 million views of my story, all because Mike put my name in the temple 20 years every week. Yeah. So you never know what seeds you plant when you do the things that the Lord asks you to do. The Lord just says, love people, love them into the church, love them back to the church, whatever. But you never know what seeds you plant. If you'd have asked Mike 26 years ago, he'd have said, this guy's lost cause. Mm-hmm. He hates the church. But look what's happened since.
He maintained that faith and that hope, and I think that's the hardest part.
Love. Yeah. He never stopped loving me.
Faith, hope, and charity.
Even though I was sometimes awfully rude to him.
At all costs, maintain the Spirit. Don't engage in contention. And what the Spirit will tell you to do is to love them.
And don't be afraid to make that first gesture. Because, again, you never know what seeds you plant. You know, if you know somebody, just say, hey, you want to come to church with me on Sunday?
Yeah.
Hey, we got this function on Saturday night. We're going to have this 50s night or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you come with me? They may say no, but the fact that you invited them
Shows love.
shows love. And they recognize that. Even through hatred or dislike or whatever, they recognize that. And you never know what seeds you plant. You know, the outside and the tree that you're sitting under the shade of right now was a seed at one point.
Yeah.
You know, you never know what happens with that seed.
I think that's an important distinction, that love includes invitations.
And love includes not being offended when they say no.
Yeah.
Just keep asking.
Because I think often we think, oh, if I'm going to love them, that means don't ever bring it up. And obviously you have to pay attention to the Spirit and know when that timing is appropriate. But there is, in the act of loving somebody, somewhat regular invitations to come join, come and see.
And sometimes things are perspective. I did a fireside once in the Salt Lake area. And some of my firesides are in the chapel, sometimes they're in the Relief Society room. And when they're in the Relief Society room, I will typically take questions and answers.
Yeah.
Okay. Before the fireside, a fellow walks up to me. He says, I was a member, not a member, will never be a member. Had faith, don't have faith, will never have faith. And I said, well, thanks for coming anyway. You know, right? So I do the fireside. And afterwards, I ask for questions. His hand raises first. I call on him. He says, I'm an attorney like you. He says, I can't prove faith exists, so I can't have faith. What do you say to that? I say, well, let me ask you a question. Do you love your wife? He said, yes. I said, how do you show her? How does she know? And he said, I do nice things for her. I said, so everybody you do nice things for, you love? He said, well, no. I said, well, let me ask you this. Does she love you? And he said, yes. I said, how do you know? He says, well, I just know she does. I said, that sounds like faith to me. I said, you don't have to prove faith, just like you don't have to prove love.
Yeah.
He had never heard that before. He had never thought of it from that perspective. He emailed me the very next day, and he said, no one's ever explained that and taken the time to explain, I don't have to prove faith. I can have faith like I can have love and not have to prove it. He said, I've already talked to my wife's bishop. I'm coming back to the church.
Wow.
A few months later, a couple of months later, he emailed me and he said, I'm getting rebaptized on Saturday. Will you come to my rebaptism? Speak at my rebaptism. And I said, yeah, I'll be there. He is a great-great-grandson of Brigham Young.
Wow. That's amazing.
Sometimes it's perspective, you know. And I think that if we are willing to listen to the whisperings of the Spirit, we'll get the answers we need for that.
So take me back. I stopped you for a minute during this part of the story. But during this 26 years, I had alluded to the fact that, you know, there were moments where, well, you had said that there were moments where you, or maybe just the whole time, where you felt this nudge to turn back. But can you pinpoint a specific moment? And it sounds like it was kind of around that time where you threw out that phrase to Mike that if the Lord wants us in Salt Lake, He'll send us there. Can you pinpoint a turning where you really felt yourself say, all right, I want... You allow God the opportunity by turning to Him. Was there a specific moment, or was it just a lot of small turns that led to the eventual?
I think if I were to say what point started the change was when I got healed from swine flu.
So that was the initial that made you start thinking.
I think so. In fact, I never talk about this, but I'll tell you. About a week after I got healed, I found out who the stake president was for where I lived in Dallas. And I went to him and I said, I made an appointment. So during that time, he looked up my old church records and everything. And I came to an appointment and I said, if I were to ever come back to the church, what would I have to do? He said, well, you were excommunicated. You'd have to have a church court. And my answer to him was, I didn't do anything wrong. I will never have a church court. And I turned around and walked out. That was 2009. The addendum to that, in 2015, when I got my testimony back, I went to the stake president, and it just happened to be the same guy from 2009. And I said, if I wanted to come back to the church, what would I have to do? And he says, I remember you. My answer is the same. You have to have a church court. You were excommunicated. And I said, whatever it takes.
Wow. The
adjust in humility, I think.
Yeah.
Is it really humble if you say you're humble? I don't know if that's true. But I know that I wasn't humble in 2009.
Yeah.
But when you have your testimony back, I was willing to do that church court. And a funny story in the church court. So I'm sitting, the stake president was kind of my advocate in this church court. But all the high priests were around the table. And one of them says, how do we know that if you find out something about the church that you don't like again, that you won't leave it again? And I said, is there something new? Because I've been using the old stuff for 26 years.
I've used all the ammo I know of.
If you know of something new, let's discuss it now. Yeah. But otherwise, I've been using the other stuff. And he went, okay, fair point.
On that point, what do you tell people who come across new anti-Mormon stuff? How do you approach that in a faithful way?
Tell me something new. To me, nothing's new.
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't heard a single thing in the last, I came back to the church in 15, so it's been 10 years this year. In fact, this is March, right?
Yeah.
It's 10 years exactly.
Wow.
Since I got my testimony back. I haven't heard anything new. And the church is so open now that it wouldn't matter at this point.
Yeah.
Because there's been no church more investigated than ours.
Right.
You know, and the part of the problem with our church, problem's a bad word, challenge with our church is if you go back to the Old Testament, you go back to the first books of the Bible. Who wrote those books? Moses.
Yeah.
Right? Do you think Moses is going to write the bad stuff about himself?
Right.
You know, we don't know the day-to-day conduct of Moses. We know what he wrote.
We don't have the documentation of some of the messy stuff that happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We don't know. But we have literally day-to-day news about Joseph Smith. And if you want to find something negative about anybody, follow him around for a week and just note and note everything they do for 5 days, 7 days, 30 days, whatever.
Right.
You're going to find a lot of negative stuff. We don't have that with Moses. We don't have that with Abraham. We don't have that. We don't know. But we do know about Joseph.
And yet there were still a lot of negative things that were written about them.
Exactly.
With the little they were focusing on the good.
Exactly. But even the negative stuff, Moses wrote his sins in such a way that may not have been as bad as what they really were.
Right. From his perspective.
His perspective.
Yeah.
And so we don't know. And I tell people all the time, you're never going to find the perfect church here. True story. And after a fireside once, a guy walks up to me and he says, can you give me a hand? Help me out. And I said, I'll do the best I can. He said, can you help me find the perfect church? I said, sure. He says, you can? I said, sure. He says, how? How can I find the perfect church? And I said, die. You know, you're not going to find perfection in an imperfect world.
Yeah.
We had that and we killed him. Mm-hmm. It was Jesus, right? So, or tried to kill him. You don't look for the perfect church. You look for the true church.
What's the difference?
Perfect means that there's no error at all, that it's perfect, perfection. By its nature, that means that there's no mistakes, no warts, no anything. But you look for the true church. You can be true. My love for Susan is true love.
Despite mistakes.
But I make mistakes.
Yeah.
Christ's love for us, the Lord's love for us is perfect love with no mistakes.
Yeah.
But the true church is going to have the fullness of the gospel, the keys of the priesthood, eternal marriage, and a prophet. How can you not have a prophet?
Yeah.
The Bible's pretty clear about that. So you look for the true church and accept the imperfections, just like you do with a person. I love my wife does not mean she's perfect. I love her with her imperfections.
Yeah.
We can love the church with its imperfections. And as long as imperfect people run the church, you're going to have mistakes, you're going to have imperfection. But you love the church for the truth it has, not the perfection that it doesn't.
Yeah. I guess one of the bigger questions or doubts or anti-positions surrounds prophets and the mistakes they make. Early church history, some of the things Brigham Young did and Joseph Smith, polygamy, I think is one of the things you allude to, is one of the biggest questions. People come to you and say, how do I handle this?
The job description for prophet does not say perfect. You got to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. Since the fireside started, I've literally had thousands and thousands of messages and emails. A lot of them just say thank you for your testimony. But some of them ask me questions, my thoughts on this or that. The number one question I get is my thoughts on polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. That's my answer. I don't care. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my salvation. But let's talk about polygamy. I'm an attorney, right? So I like to look at things from every side. But with any decision that we have in the church, every ruling, every edict, every prophecy, every whatever it is, there's only two options: from God, not from God. There's no third option. Okay? If it's from God, it's above my pay grade, as we say in the Army, above my pay grade. But if it's not from God, and I'm not saying that anything is not from God, but let's just take polygamy. Let's say polygamy, as an example, was not from God, that Joseph just made a mistake, misunderstood, misinterpreted, whatever. Then it would be just that, a mistake. So then you ask yourself, is a person still a prophet? Is a prophet still a prophet when they make a mistake? Yeah. Abraham lied. Moses killed. Peter denied. You can be a prophet and make mistakes. God does not expect perfection. He expects you to try. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your God in heaven is perfect. Matthew 5:48, I think. But we're not expected to be perfect. We're expected to work toward perfection. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have people making mistakes. Brigham Young may have made a mistake. Don't care. I go back to the basics. Did Joseph have the first vision? Yes. Did he interpret the Book of Mormon? Yes. As I say, I'm an attorney. I'm a published author, published poet, written songs, written briefs, written a book, with all my education, all my writing experience, I couldn't write the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
So how did an uneducated kid do it? I mean, the only way he could have done that is to interpret it. If you answer yes to those two questions, which I just did, then he's a prophet. Does that mean he's perfect? No. But he's a prophet. And we need to respect that and honor that. Not worship, honor, respect, love that prophet, and follow the prophet's teachings as the Lord wants us to do.
Yeah. And to your point, the church is doing a great job at being more transparent and helping explain this process. President Nelson has been very clear. This is an unfolding restoration, ongoing restoration. If you think the church has been fully restored, you've just seen the beginning, he says.
Yeah.
Take your vitamin pills because things are still going. And so to that note, it's like Joseph didn't restore the church. He began the restoration of the church, which means there's still more for us to correct, for us to have be revealed until Christ comes at his second coming, where he will come and perfect the church. In the meantime, he's testing our faith, as you mentioned, and allowing us to sift through the mistakes and seeing if we will still believe, if we will still keep the commandments despite some of the mistakes that we see.
If it was easy, everybody'd do it.
Yeah.
Look, it's hard to be a member of the church.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. We're expected to act a certain way, be a certain way, follow certain commandments that nobody else has to. It's much easier to not be a member, but not nearly as fulfilling, not nearly as satisfying. Coming from a guy who was away from it for 26 years, it felt good to come back.
What's been the greatest blessing of being back comparing to have been out?
Hope. Eternal marriage. I get my wife forever, or she's stuck with me forever, however you want to look at that. In 2022, I was diagnosed with throat cancer. Not once did I ever say, why me? I always said, why not me? And somebody asked me, why'd the Lord give you cancer? I said, the Lord didn't give me cancer. The Lord helped me through cancer. When I lost my grandson, one of the hardest things I've ever gone through, somebody asked me, why did God take your grandson? I said, God didn't take my grandson. God welcomed my grandson. You know, when you have the faith, when you understand that we don't understand everything, but that we have a Lord that has a plan, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have problems. It means that you're going to have somebody to help you through them. You know, not many people know, but I was just diagnosed last week with emphysema, a disease for which there is no cure. And I never smoked a cigarette in my life, yet I got throat cancer and emphysema. Go figure. Scary to know that you have something that can't be cured and it's going to slowly do its thing. But I can't imagine how hard this would be if I didn't have my faith and I didn't have my church family to pray for me and support me. Again, being a member doesn't mean, and loving the Lord doesn't mean you're not going to have problems. It just makes those problems a lot more bearable.
That's beautiful. And why do you share? Why do you spend 126 firesides? I mean, it's becoming your full-time job. This weekend, you find out that you're incurable, and you hop on a plane, come down to St. George.
Drove.
There you go. Drove down to St. George. Gonna speak today. I steal you to come speak earlier in the morning. Just yes, I'll do it all. There's no stopping you. Why devote so much of the life you have left to this constant sharing of your testimony?
Boy, you're the first person of all the firesides I've done or all the podcasts that I've done that's ever asked that question. I think there is no single reason, but I think part of it is I feel an obligation because for 26 years I did everything I could to hurt the church. I feel like I got to give something back. I got to atone for that, even though my sins have been forgiven. I still need to. I think that there's still an atonement process that I have to go through for that. Part of it is I know that everybody has a family member or friend that's left the church. I hope that my story is a story of hope. I want it to be a story of hope. I want people to hear my story and say, so there's hope for my son or my father or my friend or my cousin or my brother or my sister. I want them to know that there's hope. my gosh, the Lord has been so good to me. Why wouldn't I want to share that? Why wouldn't I want you to feel that? Why wouldn't I want you to feel the love that I feel, the joy that I feel? Why wouldn't I want you to have that? I think that the old Beatles song that they got from the Music Man, love isn't love till you give it away. You know, a song isn't a song till you sing it. And I think there's part of it that's how good is the love if I don't want to share it.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, Dusty. Do you have any final words for anybody out there struggling with anti-material? Anyone who's struggling with the idea of a family member struggling? What's your advice?
Number one, I would say, if you're struggling yourself, don't let your doubts overcome your faith. Don't let the things you don't know overcome the things that you do know. Don't let things that you don't understand overcome the things that you do understand. And, you know, it's one thing to say that I believe in God, but I think more importantly, there's nothing you can do that takes you out of Heavenly Father's reach. His arm's going to reach you no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what you've thought, no matter what you've said. But I think one thing that people don't think about very often, and I want people to think about, is that no matter what you do or say or think, Heavenly Father will always believe in you.
We'll leave it at that. Appreciate you coming on, Dusty. You're an inspiration to so many. Please continue sharing that testimony. It absolutely makes a difference. And even in my own life, I know that hearing your testimony, ongoing, not just once. I know you've shared it 1,000 times, but I said, come share it again, because it's been 2 years since you were on the Comeback podcast. I've told people, hey, have you heard this story? And they said, no, I haven't heard that. Well, then it's time to get them on my podcast and get the story. Like we can constantly use your testimony. We can constantly use everybody's testimony. And that's one of my messages that I'm constantly sharing, is that we all have a different perspective of how we've come to know the gospel is true. And there are people, specific people we can touch with that specific perspective. And I can touch people you can't, and you can touch people that I can't. And the Lord needs all of us to share in order to reach everybody in every quarter of the earth, in order for us to gather Israel in time for his second coming. So keep doing what you're doing. You're an amazing man. We love you. And go check him out. Dusty, where can they... I guess he's just all over the place.
I actually have a Facebook page under Dusty Smith, but there's my personal and my public figure one. At my public figure one, you can have links to different podcasts that I've been a guest on, or different things. You can even get a link to the talk by Elder Uchtdorf.
Oh, that's right.
So you can get links to anything that I've done. I always put links to them.
I'll put a link in the description here where you can go check out, learn more about Dusty. Dusty, appreciate you, and look forward to hearing from you again this afternoon.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes, please.
You know how to get a hold of me. If anybody who hears this podcast and they would like me to maybe speak to their uncle or their brother or their sister or their wife or their husband, I try to make time to do that.
What is the best way to get a hold of you?
Message me on Facebook is probably the easiest, but you also have my email.
Perfect. Awesome, will do. Well, appreciate you, Dusty, and we'll look forward to hearing from you more this afternoon.
Thank you.